Like many people currently in their 30s and 40s now, me and the Ninja Turtles series go way back. While the TMNT mania of the late 80s hit its peak when I was still pretty much a toddler, it was seeing the second live-action movie, Secret of the Ooze, that made me a bona fide Ninja Turtles fan. And like 98% of the people that loved the second TMNT movie, it was that Vanilla Ice dope-ass ninja rap song that just like totally got me hooked on the entire movie. I mean, screw Super Shredder, screw Toka and Razor, screw like everything else. Vanilla Ice, that's all that mattered.
You know, it's a show. Yeah, this is. I'm gonna give you a little taste of what we do on stage nowadays with the. Are you gonna throw that up in the air head? No, I'm not gonna do nothing that. I would never do that. That's not a. To give you an idea of what I'm talking about. There we go. So I mean. Sorry, John. Hi, Debbie. And the popcorn for everybody. Sorry about the set there, guys.
Okay, I'm totally kidding about that. In fact, it's all those awesome creatures and like super villains and just the action and everything else that just made that movie so memorable, and yeah, it left a huge impression on me as a kid. I mean, seriously, that Super Shredder reveal pretty much just made me crap my pants as like a 6-year-old. I mean, it just made it impossible not to love, and yeah, I was a huge fan of this franchise going forward. Pretty much after that, I ended up decorating my entire room in Ninja Turtles swag. You know, I had several of the action figures and some of those kick-ass vehicles, and of course I started watching reruns and also new episodes of the beloved cartoon on CBS Cartoon Express. And when I wasn't playing with the toys or watching the TV show, me and the neighborhood kids would, you know, tie socks around our heads and pretend to be our favorite Ninja Turtle characters, and yeah, while jumping off of trees and playground equipment and hitting each other as hard as we could with makeshift weapons. It's likely a miracle that one of us didn't end up in the hospital or, you know, brain dead at this point because of all the crazy, stupid shit that we did while playing Ninja Turtles. It really was an amazing time to be alive, and part of why I'm more or less addicted to revisiting that period of my life through movies, shows, and of course video games. And speaking of video games, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had some pretty awesome ones that came out during its heyday during that time period too. While I did saturate my life with a ton of TMNT merchandise and, you know, other entertainment, it was the video games that I unfortunately kind of lacked as a kid, at least to the degree that I would have wanted back then. You see, I never actually had an NES growing up, so yeah, I kind of missed out on the classics of classics, TMNT 2, the arcade game, as well as its sequel, the Manhattan Project, for the most part. And yeah, we're not even going to talk about that first game on the NES, which I fortunately never had the displeasure of playing until years later. However, between the two beat 'em ups on the NES, I got to play the Manhattan Project a handful of times at various friends and neighbors' houses, and like most Ninja Turtle obsessed children, I adored these games every time I got to play them. If you know me and my channel well enough, you may be thinking right now, well, Wiggles, you had a Genesis back then. You know, why didn't you play Hyperstone Heist? Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I actually have no idea why I didn't. In fact, I don't even think I knew about Hyperstone Heist until I was well into my journey as a collector in the 2010s. So yeah, how that one slipped underneath my radar, I have really no idea. As for its SNES counterpart, Turtles in Time, by the time I got my SNES in the mid-90s, I'd unfortunately grown out of Ninja Turtles, so yeah, even if I did know about that gem, which I didn't, I likely would have ignored it anyways.
Man, you are one pathetic loser.
In fact, the TMNT game that I had the most playtime with growing up was actually this one, Tournament Fighters. And yeah, it's alright. But you know what? I'm not here to talk about fighting games this time. I'm here to talk about the real shit. I'm here to talk about frickin' beat 'em ups. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, as an intellectual property, was practically designed for the beat 'em up genre. The marriage of Ninja Turtles with this beloved genre from the 80s and 90s went together pretty much perfectly, as it emulated the action, feel, and just overall vibe of the show and movies, as you're pretty much taking on hordes of Foot Clan soldiers before running into one of the many iconic villains that helped define the franchise. Especially in the games released during the time Ninja Turtles was practically on top of the world, those titles capture the essence of TMNT perfectly and are among the most beloved and nostalgic gaming experience for anyone old enough to be alive during that time they were coming out. Being one of those people, you know, despite my limited exposure to the games as a kid, playing these iconic beat 'em ups now later in life brought me back to Saturday morning sitting in front of the TV, play fighting with my friends in the backyard, and also feeling the excitement when when I received one of the action figures as a birthday gift. Given my love and nostalgia for the TMNT franchise, I figured why not just make a list of the best beat 'em ups that bore the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles logo, and that's precisely what I've done right here. Even well beyond the initial craze that was the original cartoon in the first few movies, TMNT Beat 'em Ups continued to be made well into the 2000s and 2010s, and what I've done is I've gone back and played every Ninja Turtles beat 'em up going all the way back to, you know, the NES and the iconic 1980s arcade machine, all the way up to the more recent releases that came out just a few years ago. Some of these games are absolutely incredible, several, you know, are just okay, and yeah, a few of them, I'd been better off never knowing they had existed at all. But regardless, all the TMNT beat 'em ups have been played, and I can confidently give you this list of the 5 best you need to get your hands on like right now. Number 5, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, The Manhattan Project. As I mentioned in my intro, Secret of the Ooze was my gateway drug into Ninja Turtles fandom, and fortunately, there was a video game that took some of the coolest villains from that movie and allowed me to smash their faces in. And I know, Turtles in Time technically beat Manhattan Project to the punch, and including Tokka, Razor, and Super Shredder, but for me, this was my first time I'd encounter them in a game. That is, of course, if I was at someone's house that actually had this game, as well as a NES Game Genie. Yeah, that's right, TMNT 3 is a lot harder than its predecessor on the NES, sometimes by design, and sometimes because of some, you know, pretty poorly designed sections, which, are just flat out cheap. But yeah, if you can forgive the occasional cheap section, or just hard as hell, cheap as hell enemy or boss, you're left with one of the most enjoyable Ninja Turtles games ever made. Released in 1992, this late release NES game took everything that made its predecessor awesome, and just gave us more of it. There was also a lot of influence from Turtles in Time, as I just mentioned, including several of the enemies and bosses, but also a greater emphasis on story and cinematics too. And just like in the first arcade game, you're able to choose your favorite turtle to play as too. At least for me, I always had to fight one of my friends to play as Leo. Yeah, I know, he's kind of the boring leader character to most people, but what can I say? He uses katanas as weapons, which, yeah, that's just badass.
What does katana mean?
It means Japanese sword.
Oh, and before I continue, Manhattan Project might have the best soundtrack of any TMNT game, period. Yeah, there are just like so many catchy, memorable tracks, some of which are still living rent-free in my head decades later. One final thing I want to mention, not just in regards to Manhattan Project, but many of the other entries on this countdown, is they are all thankfully available thanks to one of the coolest, best video game compilations like ever released. What I'm referring to, of course, is the Cowabunga collection. This collection not only gives you most of the classic TMNT titles from the late 80s and mid-90s, but even some of the more obscure handheld titles too, if that's your thing. And of course, let's not forget the bread and butter of this compilation, which is those sweet, sweet arcade perfect ports.
Kid, I just wish I had sweet kid.
But yeah, more on those later. Possibly. Okay, I'm not fooling anyone. The Cowabunga collection is arguably the most must-have TMNT game you can possibly buy. However, there is one other title not included in this compilation that you absolutely should have as well. As for the rest of the TMNT games, you can pretty much take them or leave them, but yeah, let's find out which other games you should be playing as a Ninja Turtles beat 'em up fan. Number 4, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Hyperstone Heist. There seems to be this huge misconception on the internet that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles The Hyperstone Heist is simply the Genesis port of Turtles in Time, which is something I'm here to set right once and for all. Okay, people are still gonna say this shit, but whatever. Anyhow, Hyperstone Heist was released the same year as the beloved Turtles in Time on the SNES back in 1992, and gave Genesis owners a consolation for not being able to own that SNES console exclusive. However, referring to Hyperstone Heist as simply a consolation is doing it a massive disservice, since the game is, freaking awesome in its own right. While Hyperstone Heist does borrow some levels, enemies, and bosses from Turtles in Time, and even the first TMNT arcade game, it still offers just as much of its own content to make it feel like its own distinct game too. For one, the story, while somewhat similar to Turtles in Time, revolves actually around Shredder using the legendary Hyperstone to not just steal the Statue of Liberty, but all of New York City too. And then on top of that, you get cool stages like the Dojo stage, where you get to face off against Tatsu from the movies. Then there's the exclusive bosses like the human form of Baxter Stockman, thrown in for good measure. And of course, it just wouldn't be an epic 90s TMNT beat 'em up without an epic final battle against Shredder himself, or more specifically, Super Shredder. Beyond its many differences from Turtles in Time, the game just oozes 90s Genesis charm, especially in its OST, which has that somewhat gritty Genesis sound to it. And yeah, that frickin' sound just takes me back like few other things ever could.
I don't think you like it.
Well, why not? I like this new generation of music. God, it's all toilet sounds.
The visuals are also nearly as good as the SNES port of Turtles in Time 2, which makes it just as appealing on the eyes as that game. Look, my point is, Hyperstone Heist absolutely is worth its own separate playthrough, you know, just to see how fun and unique it is, but also to see how different of an overall experience it is compared to the much more famous Turtles in Time. Number 3, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Regrettably, I was born a few years too late to have been old enough to remember the height of Ninja Turtles mania in the late 80s and early 90s. It sincerely bums me out I wasn't some hyperactive 7-year-old hopped up on soda and cheap pizza at my local Chuck E. Cheese in 1990 as my friends and I crowded around the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game like flies on a rotting carcass. When people several years older than me rave about their nostalgia for playing 1989's TMNT arcade game at their local arcade or family fun center, yeah, I 100% get it. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles the arcade game has to be one of the most masterfully themed arcade games ever made. Somehow, Konami just nailed the look, feel, and vibe of the classic TMNT cartoon and compressed it into an amazing arcade beat 'em up.
You did. You crazy son of a bitch, you did.
A few years later, they'd work this same magic on the Simpsons arcade game, which just shows you how on top of their game they were back then. Oh, how the times have changed.
That's what I thought.
Hey. Yikes. Sorry.
But anyhow, TMNT Arcade is your standard late 80s, early 90s beat 'em up, but with countless Foot Clan soldiers to destroy, most of the original iconic villains in the series to go toe-to-toe with, and appearances from April, Splinter, and of course, the frickin' Turtle Van. God, I love that van. In so many ways, this game feels like playing the iconic first season of the show, which is why so many people remember it so fondly. Of course, what those same people are probably forgetting is just how much of a quarter muncher this game was, thanks to some very cheap bosses and a few Foot Clan enemy types that, yeah, make my blood boil every time I go back and replay this game. While still pretty damn cheap and hard most of the time, TMNT Arcade was definitely meant to be played with 4 players to soften the blow a little, but also to have an excellent time no one will ever forget. Before I move on to number 2 on this countdown, it would be rude of me not to mention the heavily compromised, but in many ways equally loved NES port. Look, I thoroughly enjoyed the NES game pretty much like everyone else did back in the day. However, with the arcade version being easily accessible thanks to the Cowabunga collection, and also even the game getting its own arcade 1-up machine, you really should just play this version unless, of course, you have a soft spot for the NES game still. But with that obligatory shout out of the way, let's just keep things moving along here. Number 2, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time. When I do these countdown videos, there's typically a single port for a given game that just steals the show and is the de facto version I recommend everyone go and play. However, when it comes to Turtles in Time, I honestly can't decide whether the arcade version is better or the version on the SNES. You might be thinking, well, what the hell, Wiggles? Of course the arcade version is better. And while yes, in some ways you'd be absolutely correct about that, there are actually some meaningful ways that, you know, the SNES version is the better way to play Turtles in Time. I know, crazy, right? Let's get the most obvious bit out of the way, which, yeah, from a technical standpoint, the arcade version of Turtles in Time is vastly superior to the SNES version. Not only can 4 people play simultaneously in the arcade version instead of just 2 in the SNES port, but the graphics are noticeably better, there are a ton of funny, well-recorded one-liners from the various characters and enemies, the music sounds more crisp and clear, and there are way more enemies to fight at the same time while maintaining a smooth, solid frame rate. This might sound like an open and shut case based on what I just said, however, while the SNES lacks the beefed up arcade hardware to do all of what I just mentioned, it actually has better bosses and more of them than the arcade version. Yep, not only do fan favorites like Slash, Bebop, Rocksteady, and the Rat King exclusively show up in the SNES version, but the final boss is none other than Super Shredder himself. Yeah, just try and ignore the fact that he's a cheap-ass bastard though while you're playing against him. But Besides the greater abundance of excellent bosses, other changes included an additional Technodrome level with a very memorable Shredder fight. The second to last stage has its perspective totally changed to show off those sick-ass Mode 7 graphics. And then of course there's the additional SNES exclusive enemies and game sections, which you won't find in the arcade version. So yeah, if you were stuck with the SNES port of Turtles in Time growing up, yeah, turn that frown upside down and know you might have actually been playing the better version of that game. For me personally, I enjoy the SNES version just a tiny bit more, although there are absolutely some things about the arcade version that, yeah, I prefer that version instead. Mostly from a technical perspective, of course. And before you go thinking that these two versions of Turtles in Time deserve their own respective spots on this countdown, they are still fundamentally 90% the same exact game. What you should take away from me placing both these versions at the number 2 spot is, yeah, you really can't go wrong with either version. You know what? Hell, just play them both on the Cowabunga collection and yeah, win-win right there, boom. You definitely will not regret it either way. Number 1, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Shredder's Revenge. Pretty much most of my life, I never thought Turtles in Time could ever be topped, not just as the best TMNT Beat Em Up, but yeah, pretty much the best TMNT game, period. Well, in 2022, Tribute Games proved me and millions of other old school Turtles fans wrong by releasing Shredder's Revenge, completely blowing any expectations we had for a new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game completely out of the water. While many of the older TMNT games released during the franchise's heyday definitely capture the look and feel of what made the IP so special, Shredder's Revenge is like a distilled embodiment of everything that made OG TMNT from the late 80s and early 90s special, and somehow fit it all into a game developed and released 30 years later. Make no mistake, Shredder's Revenge is the most comprehensive TMNT game ever made. Most of the very best TMNT characters, villains, vehicles, and settings are all present in this game. If you ever lamented some side character or bad guy not making their way into the older Ninja Turtles games, Shredder's Revenge likely has you covered. The game pretty much just feels like a massive playable episode of the original cartoon series, which is probably the best compliment you can give a TMNT game in my book. This is only aided even further by an amazing OST, cool references and cameos, as well as many of the voice actors from the original TMNT series reprising their iconic roles. I mean, good lord, does this game satisfy. Aside from how this game totally nailed it in the presentation department, Shredder's Revenge also is the best playing Ninja Turtles game I have ever played. Not only is the beat 'em up action and gameplay polished and expanded beyond any other Ninja Turtles game, but there are also in-level achievements and secrets to uncover, as well as a character leveling system which allows you to make each of the 9 playable characters even stronger. Speaking of characters, you can play as fan favorites like Casey Jones, Splinter, and April O'Neil. Yeah, they are all playable and have their own moves, specials, abilities, and yeah, just all of it just makes the game way more enjoyable. Oh yeah, and if you thought you had a blast playing as 4 players in some of the old TMNT arcade games, well, Shredder's Revenge allows you to play 6 simultaneous characters, filling the screen with absolute chaos. Of course, all my footage is just me playing by myself, with myself, yeah, forever alone.
You don't have any friends. Nobody likes you.
Not listening.
But anyhow, whether you play this game with friends or not, Shredder's Revenge is a complete blast to play and is the most complete, absolute realized Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles video game you will ever play, beat 'em up or otherwise. And that, dudes, is the end of our tubular countdown. God, I'm so lame. I hope you all enjoyed this countdown and saw a TMNT game beat 'em up that you would have placed on your list if you created a top 5 too. While there were some decent Ninja Turtles beat 'em ups that didn't make this countdown, it's hard to imagine a top 5 being filled with any other games but these. And yeah, I know, there's people that love that GBA game, also people that love the PS2, GameCube games that came out during the 2000s, but yeah, for me and many other old school TMNT fans, this list is probably very similar to what you would create as well. But yeah, anyways, just let me know what your top 5 would be in the comments, or yeah, tell me how stupid I am for, not including a specific title. And if you like what you saw, yeah, feel free to click that like button, consider subbing for more arcade game and beat 'em up content in the future, and yeah, as always, it's been fun, and I will catch you all in the next Wiggles Arcade video. Take care.